Okay, so we're in a perfect position because we ended that last panel talking about the American game and the success of the American women. And we got this comment that part of it's that in the U.S., there's a cultural acceptance of women's sports, and there's an investment in women's sports institutionally, and that shapes the capacity of the team to succeed. And then we got some pushback from the moderator, right? Because Amy said, well, wait a minute. It's not really the case that female athletes are first-class citizens in the world of sports here in the U.S. And we're left in the situation where we're not really sure what to think about the status and the standing of women's sports generally, or even women's soccer, despite the success of the program. And now we want to do is look more squarely at another situation. So we're going to travel south a little bit. And the timing for this is perfect because as it happens, I'm holding in my hand this book that has it never seen the public before? Is it okay for them to tweet about it? Yeah, it's okay. All right, so check this out. It's called Futbolera, and it's a history of women in sports in Latin America. The authors, Brenda Elsey and Joshua Nadel, just happened to be sitting at the desk. And so here's the thing is that the book is being published next week. That's right. It's out for next week. So this is like a hot advance copy, which I'm going to auction off right now, because you actually can't get it if you're trying to order it on Amazon today. You would be unable to. You can't. You can order it. You can. No, you can pre-order. So that's what I say. So what we're going to do is, just hold on. So what we're going to do is, we ordinarily would do a bookseller, and we'd have the books being signed after the event. We really take pride on selling a lot of books, but since we couldn't actually get the books because they're not physically ready, at some point at the end of the session, we're all going to pull out our phones and we're going to order them on Amazon at the same time, and we're going to make this like the number one book, at least in sports. Okay, you guys with me on that?
No, I said no.
A little ambivalence because there's ambivalence about Amazon only, I think. Okay, so let me tell you guys about it. So Brenda is an associate professor of history at Hofstra, not too far from here, and got her PhD at SUNY Stony Brook, right? A Latin Americanist, the author of Citizens and Sportsmen, Football and Politics in 20th Century Chile, and also she does a lot of other more public-facing writing, like in The Guardian and The New Republic and Sports Illustrated. And as you will see in about an hour, when we have a really special thing for you, she is a co-host of the weekly Feminism and Sports podcast, which Josh is wearing on his shirt. Burn it all down. And I'm sure you brought shirts for all of us, right? Is that, okay. Quid pro quo. So the stylish man to her left, Joshua Nadel, is an associate professor of Latin American and Caribbean history at North Carolina Central University. He's the author of Football, Why Soccer Matters in Latin America, and lots of other scholarly work. And he too has published in outlets with a big public profile like Foreign Policy and the Washington Post's newsletter Monkey Cage, as well as the Telegraph. The format here is I'm just going to let them take control because this is more or less their book launch, and they need as much airtime as we can give them. So they're going to jump up. They've got slides and everything for us, and then I'll jump up and moderate a little bit, but we'll just do a bunch of Q&A. So I don't know how you two plan to do it, but the floor is yours, so go for it.
We're not sure either. Do I need a microphone, or are you hearing me all right?
You need a microphone because we've got
Okay. Oh, right. Okay. All right. Sounds good. It's fine. Well, we want to thank everyone for bringing us today, and Amy as well for being a point person for the event. Josh and I have never presented on this book together. People that bring us separately. They figure, whoever's closer to wherever the university is or something like that. So it's pretty exciting.
And we also haven't seen each other in...
No. Here, you got to turn it on. There you go. How's that?
Look at that. We haven't seen each other since 2015 in person for 4 years. So
Thank
somehow
you,
we
Google
managed
Docs.
to write this book. Exactly. Thank you, Google Docs.
Yeah. So it's a real pleasure, and thank you for bringing us and inviting us today. So usually when you think about soccer in Latin America, these sorts of images might come to mind. And it's not only a popular issue of the marginalization of women, it's actually an academic issue, because many times you'll see a class, for example, taught on sport and society, and they're going to use this book by Eduardo Galeano, which is a much loved book, a very sort of celebrated writer from Uruguay, who is probably most famously known for Open the Veins of Latin America in the 1960s, kind of anti-imperialist, leftist figure. And at the end of the 20th century, he writes this book, and he says, post-dictatorships in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, can we reimagine a Latin American identity that's not about war or violence or authoritarianism? And he chooses soccer to do it. And it's a very, as you might expect from his other writing, a sort of critique of capitalism, critique of authoritarianism. And he has 0 women. There is no woman, not a fan in the entire book, not a mention. And it's still assigned all the time. And I have to say, it is a source of great frustration to me, because it is a beautiful way to reimagine Latin American identity. It is a great way. And what does it mean to imagine such a thing with the total incomplete absence of women? And we're going to talk about Latin America, and we can open it up to comparisons with the United States. But one thing that's certainly different is that in the US, soccer is not, and I'm sorry because I'm going to use football, but just like when I say football, can you think soccer? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And so what I have to say is it's different than the US, because in the US, soccer is not the national sport. So it is not easy to make that kind of comparison. It's almost like saying North American football. What does gender inclusion in the NFL look like today? It's not, really apples and apples in that sense. So we hope it becomes a national sport in the US maybe. But it isn't exactly. So you have these sort of not only popular, but academic marginalization of women. We both wrote first books. They were 90% about men and masculinity, mine too. We got to the end of those books and we went, we don't feel quite right about what, at least me. I guess I'm speaking for you, but interrupt. I didn't feel quite right about the social history that I did. So yes, I talk about the history of masculinity and things like that. But it was also the sort of protests that were going on in the period in 2012, 2013, the neglect of the federations of the national women's team that were inspiring us to do this. So I'm going to talk for a minute about just what's been happening over the few years in Latin America. Then I'll switch to Josh for some cool history. So these are the guys that reign over South American soccer. You should know that women started playing soccer in South America in 1909, 1910. We like to say that the British invented it and the South Americans perfected it. And so it starts right away in the port cities of Latin America. And so it's not like these guys just like took over a women's game that didn't exist. It's at least 100 years old. And, you may recognize some of these figures. They're sort of corrupt and interchangeable. Sergio Hadwe, for example, who was the head of the Chilean Federation, is on house arrest in Miami. One is dead, one's been arrested. They're banned from football, et cetera, et cetera. So these are... Right, many of them are in jail. They're difficult for me to distinguish. But Naput's over there, the Paraguayan guy. So anyway, these are the heads of South American football. This is who's in charge. Okay, I'll just leave that there. And they were not responding to the protests of women throughout the Americas. And it started in South America, but has since gone, throughout the Americas and headed north. And when they weren't being listened to through petitions, through kindly requests for meetings, by, they're not allowed in coaches' licenses courses. They're not allowed or permitted in many different structural issues. Like I said, this is the representation of women in CONMEBOL. Okay. So when they weren't being listened to, they took it to the pitch. And that's what's been very interesting and new over the last, 5-6 years, and gotten some real attention and some real traction. And they've gained some allies within, the federation and within global football. And so here we looked in our book at 2014 and 15, 16. So after the Copa America Femenina in 2014 in Ecuador, what happens is they'll support the national team during this brief tournament, which qualifies women in a 2-week period for the Pan American Games, the Olympics, and the World Cup all at once. It's really great. And as soon as that's over, as soon as that tournament's over, they schedule no more matches for 18 months. They become inactive by FIFA because if you don't respond to, invitations. So you have women's rankings, and then we found, the Argentine, the Chilean, the Brazilian team, will all go, well, not the Brazilians, but everyone else will go inactive and drop off. So they're like 170th in the rankings, if there's a thing. There's not a thing. They don't even rank them. They become inactive. And so if you look at Argentine's history and you go to FIFA's webpage and you look at the activity of the Argentine women's team in 2015, it's 0 games. 0 games played. And we interviewed these women and we would say, what's the status of the team? And they would say, I have no idea if I'm on the team. We don't have a coach. We haven't been convened in 16, 17 months. We don't even know. So we started working on this, and this is the Argentine women's team in 2018, who you're going to see since the first time since 2007 at this year's World Cup, doing this kind of famous, gesture. Does anybody know what it is? Any Argentine fans know what it refers to? Tell them, Josh. Yeah. But it's from Topo Giglio, which is, so Mauricio Macri? Do you know who he is? He's the president of Argentina. Chris, no, come on. He's the president of Argentina, and he used to be the president of, right. And when he was president of Boca, he made so many players mad for trying to undercut them on salaries that every time Riquelme scored, he's a famous Boca player, he would go up to where Macri was sitting and be like, do you hear me? Right? And so the women are taking this gesture, which is like a whole interesting repertoire. And we see during these protests, the men's teams for the first time going on social media and kind of supporting them. And Messi even tweeted something out 2 months ago, and you can't get him to do anything he's not social. I love him, but he's not the most social media sort of guy. So these are some pretty big things that they've accomplished there, and we can talk about that in a bit. And then they played Puerto Rico's first international friendly last August, was with the Argentine national team. The captain of the Puerto Rican team called the captain of the Argentine team and said, if we protest, will you just sort of kick about for a while so we can get some photographs and send a message? And the Argentine team was like, of course, And they said, well, we have our own variation. We have our own variation on that because Puerto Rican women have their own. They were like, we're not just going to, mimic what you're doing. We've got our own twist on this. But it's similar. You can see the idea or something like that. So we started working on this, and as we were working on this, the protests got more and more intense, to the point where 2017, the Argentine women went on national strike. The Chilean women went on strike in 2015 and unionized under the men's union, and we can talk about that as a really interesting thing because the U.S. women have not unionized. They're an association but not a union. Chilean women are not professional but have unionized. So there's interesting paths there, right, that you could talk about what happens. Cristiane, who's the second most capped player next to Marta for the Brazilian national team, retired in protest of the conditions in 2017 with 2 other players, Rosana, Tamira, nope, I'm wrong on both counts. Anyway, no Rosana. And there was a third. And they protested. Cristiane since come back, but she's injured, so we don't know if we'll see her in this particular tournament. But they were very painful protests. I mean, Cristiane is a great player. She's played 88 times or something for the Brazilian national team, second highest goal scorer in the history. And it was painful to see her on Instagram do this retirement. She's in tears. I don't know if you want to talk about. I was in tears just watching it.
The retirement was largely around the rehiring of Nadel, right? So
right.
So the Brazilian national team was coached by a woman for a year who replaced this guy Nadel.
5 games.
Right.
She had 5 games they gave her.
I think 12, but still.
No, I think 5 losses.
5 losses, right. So she had 7 wins, 5 losses, and a couple draws, and they were like, you're done. And then they replaced her with the old coach, Nadel, who was very unpopular among the players, and this caused open resignations from a bunch of players, more than 3, I think. Many of whom then came back onto the squad.
Yeah. So, and what they're protesting, and this goes for all of these CONMEBOL teams, and we can talk about some of the CONCACAF teams. We've interviewed on Burn It All Down people from the Jamaican national team, from Trinidad and Tobago, who also face really similar situations. In their case, there's no woman representative, no coaches, no support. In Argentina, every training they make $8.50. And when they went on national strike in 2017, it wasn't even to get a pay increase. It's because the federation simply hadn't paid it in 9 months. And so it doesn't pay for their gym memberships. It doesn't pay for their tolls. It costs them money to do it. Which has been really frustrating. So we started doing this, and one of the justifications for denying women's resources is it's new. It's new. You just started playing. Like, just be patient. That's what they love to, tell women all the time, right? Just be patient, settle down, and eventually it'll develop, right? There's this progressive sort of logic to it, and what we wanted to do with this, and then I'll switch it to Josh, was to sort of give them some sort of architecture to say, here's our book, use it. This is not new. It's a century old. It's not okay to deny them resources on the basis that this is a new sport, because it's absolutely not new. And when journalists recreate that narrative, all they're doing is justifying that disparity of resources again and again and again. And I get it, you want to be positive out there. I'm super, I don't get invited to parties with this rhetoric. I get it. It's not like super charming or fun, and like I'm a downer everywhere I go. But it is so true. It's so true. But what the case really is that what you're doing is sort of justifying this over and over with this progressive model. Like, things are always getting better, and they're not getting better, and there's no reason for them to be patient, and there's reasons for them to take it to the pitch and do these demands now. And they are getting certain responses, which we'll talk about at the end of the talk. There actually is, as doom and gloomy as I am, there are signs of progress, and we'll talk about where they are. But let Josh take you through some history. Okay. There. Yeah.
I'll stand up. Oh, look at that. Yeah. Hello. So this is, right, part of this larger, let's say, project to uncover the past of women's football in Latin America, right? And it's old, right? So you have this team. This is actually, I'm pretty sure this is 1902. Is that 1902?
It's dated that.
We're not
at the museum,
right?
Yeah.
So we don't know where this actually appeared ever, if it ever appeared. It was at the National Museum in Chile, but it says, for those who don't read, it never would have occurred to us that a club of young women pertaining to the weaker sex, weaker and beautiful sex, would have formed a football club, right? It never would have occurred to this. They are training to rob men. Women now basically are training to rob men from all fields, including the football field, right? So this picture is like, oh my God, women played football in Latin America. Women play football. That's so shocking. What's amazing about this photo, I don't think that's in here, but 18 years later, there's a different photo of a different team with the exact same caption. Literally the exact. So it's like 18 years later, it's like, look at that. Soccer exists. Women play soccer. How shocking, right?
Who would have thought?
So the point is that women played soccer from the early 1900s. So we've got early 1900s Chile I'm going to slide to, this is also Chile actually, from 1919, right? A grand festival, a big festival, right? There are women's soccer games going on. By 1919, there are leagues in Chile. There are at least 9 teams playing in Chile that have pretty regular coverage. The media in Chile actually knows enough about the teams and is doing some support work for the teams, but knows enough about the teams to quote, to sort of describe the teams to the press, or to the readership, excuse me. So, there's one team that has the most skilled players. There's another team that is always the strongest of the teams in the league. So they're doing this sort of, the journalists clearly knew the teams, had clearly been to the games, but there's very little reporting on it. Interestingly, also the journal, the magazine, I don't think it was El Mercurio, but one of the newspapers supported the clubs as well, right? So they would have meetings in their offices. They would help them to get fields, and this was something that happened in Brazil as well, and also, as we'll see, in Mexico later. Moving along, we have women's football in Buenos Aires, right? In the 1920s, with women coaches, for the record.
They play and coach.
They play and coach. Yeah, exactly. I mean, shockingly, right? But again, and you see, I mean, we assume that there is some, as Brenda said, England invented the sport and South America perfected it. We assume that there's some influence from Europe as well going on here, because in Europe there had been women's matches going on, and in the 1920s, early 1920s, there's a lot of international activity between France and England playing. There's also a ban put on women's soccer in England in 1921, which we'll come back to in the case of Brazil. But so we have sort of, evidence in the press of women playing football. It's really like, it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack to get the material, right? Like you find something you find something in 1923, 5 years later, there's another article, and there's nothing in between. So it's like trying to weave the book together. It was very, very difficult in that regard. But so again, we have the first team of football in Chile,
Coquimbo.
in
No, in
Coquimbo,
Coquimbo.
in a town outside of Santiago. It's from 1927, I believe.
Yeah.
It's Ororo Porteño. Again, we know very little about the team other than this. There's no coverage, no nothing.
But the reason to talk about this too is do the last one.
The one
The
before.
last, yeah. Okay. So this is obviously a pretty upper class team. We're not quite so surprised to see a lot of white porteñas as we are, next slide, to see these laundry workers. So this was started by a laundromat owner. So just interjecting here, sorry with a little chilenismo, but what you have here are these laundry workers, and the guy up on, sort of in the suit up there is the owner of the laundromat. He's the coach, right? And then you have this, and then I don't know if you can read Spanish, because I just butt in here for one small second because I love this so much. Someone donated this photograph to a local museum in Chile, and what it says in the 40s. So even though the photograph's from 27, it's from the 40s, and this is going to come up for everyone that's played any sport as a woman ever. It says here, today these players are respectable wives, some of them. Many of them. It says, and then it lists for you who are the respectable wives. Like, woo! And I mean, just a point to make, like, the surveillance of their femininity and the surveillance of their heterosexuality is just intense in all places, whether it's Brazil or, not all places, but all places we study in the book. It's just a really intense, and this is just sort of a perfect example of like identifying them, just so that the local museum could just say, don't worry about these ladies, they're straight. Anyway, go ahead. You could switch. Yeah, please.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
Could you go back to the first image you showed?
Yep.
Because I didn't get a chance to read it all.
One more. Yep.
The question,
Wait.
No.
Right there.
¿Quién se atreverá a luchar contra estos grupos de gracias?
Yeah, like,
The tone. What's the tone of that question?
yeah.
Because that to me is important.
So just, do you want to translate?
Who would be brave enough to play against these lovely gracias?
Yeah, like,
Against these lovely ladies, right?
yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and the tone of that question to me is like,
Well, who dares, right? Who dares?
but is also that, well, I don't know, Josh, you might want to say something different. I mean, what I would argue is that it's about this sort of like protective, like positioning oneself as a protector and as a passive, even though what they're doing is really aggressive, which is to say, you're stealing our leisure time, you're stealing our public space, how dare you? But goodness, are you pretty? Who would wanna who would want to interfere with you? Like, it's sort of like that positioning. For me, that's the way it reads. I don't know for you.
Because it also, I just got a glimpse of it before
Yeah.
you switched.
Yeah.
But it's totally something that you'd see in a Nike ad today. That would be about empowerment, right? Where the tone kind of like switches. I was just
It is a tone switch.
a big time.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. I think there's a big tone switch, and I think that the narratives in sport media today often do the same thing, which is heavy tone switching.
But still playing on very sort of stereotypical ideas about womanhood and beauty and right.
Yeah, no, and the narrator and the interlocutor always being male. Right? Is always being, this is not signed, but it's quite clear that it's not written by a woman. I mean, you know, and that's true of almost all of.
Biological moment that doesn't include
Right.
women.
Exactly. Sort of like, you know, we could talk about Nike and woke branding, which Frank Garitti has done some stuff, you know, recently with me too, on woke branding and, you know, the who would think I was crazy stuff. I mean, there's a lot to pick apart there in who's supposed to be the omniscient narrator in that. But I think that's a good point. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. Skip ahead.
Moving ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Circuses. So in Brazil, the first sort of recognized women's soccer game happens in 1921 between these two teams that are very close to each other, or two towns that are pretty close to each other on the Sao Paulo Railroad, and leagues develop relatively quickly in Brazil. I'll get to this in a second, but by the 1930s you have like the thousands of hundreds of teams around Brazil playing, also with the support of Jornal do Sport, which is this sort of new journal. It starts in 1931 and almost immediately starts writing about women's football and supporting it. Again, helping, generally speaking, it's not always supportive of it. Depends on the sort of the author, it depends on the year, but they do sort of this work of organize, they publish numbers for women who want to play, to contact, they have meetings in their offices, and so there's this sort of growth of women's football outside or in public, let's say, or in acceptable spaces. At the same time, there's a growth of women's soccer somewhat earlier in the 20s in circuses, right? And this is sort of, we've sort of thought about this a lot in terms of why circuses and how. And what they did, it would often be teams of 5 women against teams of 5 women, so 5v5, and they would take on the team local rivalries wherever they were in Brazil. They would sort of take on 2 teams, put on their jerseys, and play each other. And this is sort of this. It's a place where obviously soccer is a spectacle here, as opposed to let's say quote unquote serious sport. But at the same time, it provides women the space to play soccer in a space that allows for generally transgression, right? So women are transgressing. The dominant literature at the time is sports literature and physical education literature is basically saying women should not play soccer. It is dangerous for their health. They will get uterine cancer. They will become infertile. They will get breast cancer. All of this stuff is like that is the norm at the time, and still to a certain extent into the 1970s.
Yeah. I mean,
right?
The thing that we found shocking, and we can come back to this, is that really people know it's pseudoscience even when they're accepting it. So the Brazilian Federation at that time, which is not the CBFA today, right? It's the CBD. CBD that then CND. So the Brazilian Federation knows that this is anecdotal, but remember that one journal where it says that women's circulatory system is centered in the ovaries,
yes.
And thus if a ball hits them here, they'll stroke out, essentially. Like that's, and
it's like, it's insane, right?
Right. I mean, it's like, I don't even know we didn't even know how to write about that. Like we were just like, right? But you have to say that the truth is that it's not just bad medical knowledge, because good medical knowledge is out there. Right. It's just cherry picked from, anybody that lives know that doesn't happen. I mean, if you have a child, like, I don't, like, what, labor? Like, I don't, like, you have kids, some of you, like, they punch you in the stomach all day long. Like, I don't, when they're 2 or 3 or something like that, no more cookies. and you're not stroking out. So it doesn't take anything
No.
to know this. And so they're purposefully using that. And so that's important because people will be like, oh, the medical profession was so oppressive. And it's like, well, they're really digging at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, there are doctors that are quite aware.
Although,
Anyway.
that said, totally true. However, like in England, when the ban goes on in 1921, it's an article in The Lancet, which is like a very well-respected public health journal.
Fair.
Right? That is like, yeah, women's soccer, dangerous for girls, they shouldn't play it. And so England bans women's soccer for 50 years, basically, right? Which also maybe perhaps leads into the next slide, which is that in Brazil, women's soccer was banned from 1941 to 1981. There was the leagues sort of continued to progress through the 1930s. And by 1940, there are, again, sort of thousands of teams around Brazil. There's one particular guy who writes a letter to the president of Brazil at the time, Getulio Vargas, who says, like, basically just in Rio, there are 200 teams, and if they're allowed to play, these will be the destructive nuclei of the nation. And that is a quote, that women's soccer would create the destructive nuclei of the nation, because the public health concern of recreating the nation, of raising good citizens, right? So women would not want to have sex with men. They would become deformed, which is another sort of using male concepts of beauty. They would become deformed by playing, and they would become depressive. So these were all reasons that women's soccer had to end. And I'm going to turn it over to you for part of that stuff on the ban, I guess.
Well, in general, the more soccer becomes identified with national identity and as a proper channel to develop masculinity, the more violently women are marginalized. So the more important it is. So it's like, what? Right. So the more, so that's why I talk about the U.S. a little, and I say, well, there's not really this whole quite the same history, which doesn't mean there's not tons of obstacles and discrimination that we've heard about that's so important. But to say, to do a ban, part of it shows you how important football, like soccer, had become to defining what Brazilians were. I mean, they didn't have the greatest army in the world. They didn't have, Chris Gaffney is here too as a specialist on Brazil. But I mean, right, by the 40s and 50s, this is like such a thing that all different kinds of institutions and politics can get behind. And so it becomes more and more important to push women away from that. And that's what we saw throughout. But they don't stop playing. This is a photograph from 1958. We find that they stopped playing in more so, at least, in Rio and Sao Paulo, and less so in the provincial places. So this is from Minas Gerais. More teams in Minas Gerais, more in Belo Horizonte, which is the main city there, more in Bahia.
Yeah.
And that's where players come from today. So we think that has something to do with something. That's a central place for players. That's where Marta and Sissi and Formiga, I mean, they're sort of regularly.
From the back, from outside of the main.
Right, not growing up in the Rio, Sao Paulo leagues, which is what you would expect, and certainly for the men, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
And then could we also maybe assume, not that it was clear that
Maybe. It's hard to tell. I mean, it's just not in the sources as such. The difference, I think, but correct me, is that the British ban is from the FA. It's from the Federation.
Right.
This is from the government. And so the government putatively would not like really have an interest necessarily in the cash of the league. Do you know what I'm saying? So I feel like in England it's more so. In Brazil it's more about Vargas pleasing these institutions. And I don't know, Josh, you want to say?
Totally, I agree. There's also this element, though, where the state takes on the role of protector, and there's a lot of concern about men sort of exploiting women's soccer for their own economic gain. So it's
Yeah.
Right, so it's not so much that women would sort of get economic power so much as they might be quote unquote exploited. But it's an incredibly paternalistic and
a lot about
wrong-headed
race in Brazil. Like when the women Primavera in Rio
Yeah.
go to court, they have an invitation to go play in Argentina. It's Argentina.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, because you write a book and then it's like 2 years you don't see it. And so I'm like, thank goodness you're here. I'm like, okay. So you're already working on the next stuff, right? Right. So they go to court to try to get to play abroad because their idea is this ban applies in Brazil. But does it apply to us if we play abroad as Brazilians? And the court rules, yes, it does. So Brazilian women can not only not play in Brazil, but they can't play anywhere else. And the logic is that the Argentines were just going to make fun of Brazilian women of color. So they said, we're going to save you from this embarrassment that the Argentines are going to give you because you're going to go and they're going to make fun of you for being black. Morenas.
Yeah. And also Primavera was also run in on potentially being
Sex trafficking. They
that
also
was another-
accused the female coach, again, because there was no real love of soccer possible. It must be some perverted sexual thing. They accused the coach of trafficking in minors because she wants to take them to Argentina to play this invitational, and they end up not being able to go. And I think it appears in court like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
In this period. So it's a lot of intersecting with race too in Brazil, and like who it spreads to is problematic. The fact that it's, working class women of color, oof, that hasn't even, then the state needs to be even more productive, right?
Yeah.
Okay, anyway. Go ahead.
Next slide.
Sure.
How are we doing on time?
I think you guys are ready for the road.
We're ready. We're
Does that mean we should finish?
No, it means you got it.
Oh, okay. Okay, next.
Oh,
This is Josh's bag.
Oh,
Here, you
okay.
do
So on the other hand, so as Brazil is like banning women from traveling and playing soccer, in 1949 in Costa Rica, a team is formed. Right? There's a couple of different origin stories, but both of them center around a funeral. So 2 brothers. The Bonilla brothers, their father dies, and at the wake, apparently, either one of the brothers or one of their cousins, who is a woman, say, hey, why don't we start a soccer team? Which seems a little bit bizarre, right? Just out of the blue, but this is every origin story, and we've actually talked to one of the brothers who is still alive. He's like 94, and he's awesome.
Josh talks to him.
I talked to him.
I don't know. I won't take credit.
But so in June of 1949, this team starts and they begin to practice. By 1950, they have an exhibition in front of it at the National Stadium. The president is there. The president of Costa Rica is there. The match goes swimmingly, according to the one article of the press. The oranges that the fans had brought to throw at the women players were eaten because the skill was so good. The skill of play was so high, right? So instead of throwing fruit at players, they ate the fruit. And another article said, I never thought that that women would be able to play this game of masculine ink, right? Which is like tinta masculina, which I've always thought of as a great phrase. But so from there, this team begins to travel. So they play 2 games in Costa Rica in 1950, and then they take off. They go to Curacao, they go to Cuba, they go to Colombia. There's actually a big kerfuffle in Colombia. They're stopped at the border because the morality police of Colombia say their shorts are too short. They play in Panama. They play sort of all over for the next 4 or 5 years. They're sort of constantly on the move, sort of missionizing soccer, really, missionizing women's soccer around Central America and the Caribbean. There is a lot of resistance to women playing in Costa Rica as well. The similar sort of pseudoscience gets drawn out to say, well, women will get hurt, it's going to deform their muscles, their legs are going to get too big. It's, again, all sort of based on sort of male gaze ideas of what feminine beauty should be. And there is a Senate hearing in the same way that in Brazil, it sort of goes to the national government. And in the Senate, the Costa Rican Senate says, you know what? that's ridiculous. Like, women are gonna continue to play soccer. There's no reason why we should ban it. So why not? And throughout the 1950s, there are about 8 teams that form in Costa Rica and play. This team really, Deportivo Femenino, really only plays outside of Costa Rica until the 1960s. But it is, again, it goes sort of everywhere. And
Mexico.
In Mexico. In the 1960s, it goes to Mexico. And the sense is that this is the team that sort of brings the sport to Mexico. And then Mexico has sort of an explosion in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Kind of like apostles of baseball are Cuba.
Yeah.
Like, is it right? I mean, you kind of think of them, I don't know if that's fair, maybe Puerto Ricans. I don't, I'm looking nervously at the audience. But I kind of think, Cubans, apostles, baseball, I sort of think of them.
Although Cubans learned baseball from Mexico. That's another story.
Okay. Next slide.
So, So, speaking of 1970, so by 1969, 1970, women's soccer begins to take off in Mexico. The first team is again, exhibition. It's fans of America, Club America. And they form 2 teams in 1969. By the end of 1969, there are over 200 teams in Mexico. By 1970, I'm just going to sort of race through. I don't know.
Yeah, race.
By 1970, there's teams in almost in most Mexican states. There are leagues, in most Mexican states. There are 4 leagues in Mexico City, and Mexico gets invited to the first unofficial Women's World Championship, which happened in 1970 in Turin, in Italy. And the organizers of the league get together a national team. They get 0 support from the Mexican Federation. In fact, the Mexican Federation, on their return from Italy, the Mexican Federation, the guy in the federation who is in charge of amateur soccer says no one in Mexico will recognize anything that they've done. They get support from the municipal government,
UNAM.
and from UNAM, from the university, and from actually some Mexican men's players who provide them with balls, shoes, and help them get uniforms. Enrique Borjas, who played at the time, is one of the main supporters. So they finished 3rd in Mexico. In Turin, in Italy, and the Mexican press is as with Brazil, by sort of soccer is essentially the national sport in Mexico, and the press is well, they're going to Italy and they'll put up a good fight because they're Mexican and that's what Mexicans do. We put up good fights, right? And then the first match, the official score was 9-0. I've talked to a bunch of people who were there. Some say it was actually 11-0, and some say it was 15-0 with a bunch of goals disallowed. But so Mexico went to Austria and went to Italy and crushed Austria in the first game, and then finished 3rd. What that meant was that they then came back, and the Italian team came to visit Mexico in 1971, and Mexico won the rights to host the second unofficial Women's World Championship, which was in 1971. Do you want to take over there?
Well, this is Estadio Azteca. Then it has about 100,000 people. 110. I'm sorry, 110,000 people. And it's totally full, and it's standing room only, and it gets great press. And I just want to underscore the fact that, women can organize it independently at the time. They've proven this from 70 and 71. I think, women might need football institutions, but I think football institutions need women more. And I think this was, is a real crowning achievement. And I wish very much that FIFA would recognize it. If you go to FIFA's archives, which I've done, is in Zurichburg. I know some other people have in this room. You go 7 floors down, like the Bat Cave, and you get into the with your thumbprint,
keys.
But you could still jimmy the door to go back and forth to the bathroom. So it's security is so much. And so you walk in and they actually have the album from this unofficial World Cup. So it's not out of the idea, but they don't have the trademark for it. But it's a really great achievement, and I think it's worth just underscoring going into this one. And Josh wrote about it a long time ago. I didn't so much. This is the Argentine team, and just a funny story. It's the only other Latin American team that goes. And the Argentine team they get there. This is a older team, and you're going to see today Argentina also fields one of the oldest teams in the tournament, if not the oldest team. I was trying to do the math the other day, but I got distracted by something. And so anyway, this is the Argentine team. They get there and they come in 2 waves because they can't pay for the hotel for the whole time. So they send the best players first and figure they'll need the hotel. You know, they come like 3 days before, and then the other people come the next day. And their coach just never makes it. Like, I don't know, like, drinking binge, other stuff to do. I'm really not sure. So they go, and the thing that was so hard for us to figure out is we kept seeing who we thought were the Argentine teams in Mexican uniforms. And we were like, but that doesn't look like the Mexican team. And as it turns out, the Mexican team loaned them a coach and their uniforms. And so it finally, but they have a great website called Las Pioneras, if you're ever interested, that goes back and they do their own history and really admire their work in Argentina. So I just want to say a lot of these women are doing their own histories and they're really exciting and all over the place.
And I just want to add that though this is the reason that this match, that most of the matches, so the matches took place at Azteca and Estadio Jalisco in Guadalajara. The reason that they took place in those two stadiums is because those were municipal stadiums. The Mexican Federation actually passed an edict that said if any of their teams that are affiliated allowed the women to play or practice on their fields, they would get a ban from the league and a fine. Right. So there were active efforts on the part of the Mexican Federation to sort of submarine the tournament, right?
And shut down male allyship.
Right, and shut down male allyship.
Which we can talk about with the Copa America being scheduled for the exact same dates as the Women's World Cup.
We totally can.
Yep, we're wrapping up. We got 2 more quick slides, 3 more. Just to say that finally, really in 81, the ban is overturned, but it takes the Federation of Sao Paulo, for example, till 1983 to approve it. When they do, they try to put weird rules, 70 minutes duration, only smaller ball, and you can't exchange shirts. They were really nervous about that. Whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know what to say. The only other thing I'll say is Sao Paulo also institutes through the 1990s, and you might remember the Golden Boot winner of the 1999 World Cup, where she shares it with a Chinese player. Sissy shaved her head in reaction to Sao Paulo saying you had to have a ponytail to play in the tournaments, and she could never play again in Brazil. I don't think she really wanted to at that point. But they do all this type of stuff through until like the early 2000s. So it's like, and then the other justification for not supporting women's sports is they don't have a market. There's no market. Couple things about that. The pressure was, the women now have to market themselves. They have to, use sexual objectification in order to do it. And I think what we were trying to show and demonstrate in the book is that men's, I don't know, Chris Gaffney knows, how much did the Brazilian government spend on the 2014 World Cup? 15 billion US. So, why do they need to make up their own market and the men can lose $15 billion US? So the expectations of market logic should always be questioned. It's an enormous state investment in the men's game in Brazil. And the idea that women just plop down and make a market for themselves after, 40 years of a ban and whatever is just, ridiculous.
Ludicrous.
Do you want to say something? I don't know. I'm just going to scream after this over and over. Here.
However,
here's some high point. He's
positive.
going to do
We're
the
gonna
rosy.
a little bit of positive.
He's the optimist.
Not that much though. So recently, right? I mean, I assume that y'all have been paying attention to some of the news coming out of Europe and big matches, right? So the Atletico Barcelona women's match had 60,000, and Juve's women had 49,000. The Olympic Lyon against PSG Feminine had 25. Right, there are all these great numbers in Mexico. The Ida y Vuelta for the league championship had over 60,000, and last year there were 90,000 in those 2 matches. So we could say a growing fan base, right? Or a growing recognition, visibility of women's football around the world. I'm only rosy for that small period of time, right? Because a lot of those, sorry, but because a lot of those large numbers are sort of one-off events. They sort of belie the fact that there is no institutional support or very little structural support for women's soccer anywhere in the world. If you look at the professional leagues, NWSL, I'm sure Stephanie, you might correct me on this, or can correct me on this, but the average attendance is around 6,000 on a good day because of Portland. Mexico has sort of the second largest. Their average is around 2,300 people per game. But then even in Europe, where you have sort of increasing television rights and increasing televisation of games, the average attendance is under 2,000 per game. In a lot of leagues, it hovers around 1,000 people per game or less, right? So the Champions League is a little different, but in the French league, the Spanish league, the Italian league, the English league, the averages are around 1,500 or less per game, depending on what league.
And we're getting the sign to wrap up.
Yeah, so that's...
But thank you very much for your attention, and we're here. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Oh, no. Different hair tie.
So we have lots of time for questions. So floor's open. Is that hand in the way back? Okay, so yeah. No, just hold on one second. Can you bring this back? So hand here, and then Stephanie. Just 1 second. When I said you're ready, what I was trying to say is it's great. Don't worry. Yeah.
We could take it on the road, like
Yeah.
dog and pony show.
He's so much nicer, though. He's like the good cop, right?
Whatever you're doing is working, so don't worry. Yeah. Don't analyze yet.
Detroit, yeah, that's
Okay,
yeah.
so in the very back, behind the speaker, yeah. She's coming.
All right. Okay, good. It's maybe a little off topic, but I think it's germane to today's topic generally, is that we're seeing a lot of, or more, or some that we never saw before, persons transitioning from male to female, competing in female divisions of sports competitions. And do you believe we'll be seeing some of that or more of that in international competitions or even club level football being played in women's divisions? And might there be a differentiation between, say, those nations like America where that thing seems to be more commonplace opposed to those nations where there doesn't seem to be as much gender fluidity in the athletic sphere?
Okay.
You know, let's take a couple questions.
Okay.
There's
Okay.
if you go up to your hand. Yeah. Just hold on 1 second. We'll take a couple questions together. Yeah.
I just needed a point of clarification. You talked about that guy who wrote in about like there's 200 teams around Rio, and if they're allowed to play, like everything is going to collapse. Is that a corroborated figure, or was he exaggerating? Or around Rio, about approximately how many women's teams have you found in that at that time were playing?
Yeah.
And let's just do one more question, just right here.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the panel. Very interesting. Did you find in your archives interjections by the Catholic Church?
Good question. Thank you. Okay, there's already trans teams in places like Brazil. One grassroots team is Meninos Bons de Bola, who does a lot of grassroots work on inclusion in Brazil. I would expect and hope that we see more and more, but the Bolsonaro government in Brazil right now is very abjectly hostile to trans community and any sort of, he calls it gender ideology. And so he's actually come out in opposition to gender equality. So that will make it really difficult, and I'm not sure those people will feel very safe to be included in that particular realm. But as as there are more grassroots efforts, you hope that these teams get some support and protection, but you do worry during this particular government about that. I don't think that there's anything like cast or Semenya, like an effort to sort of target one particular event or anything for an advantage about testosterone. I would find that to be surprising in the case of soccer. But who knows what governing bodies will try to regulate when it comes to gender. Anything and everything. So it's a good question about the future, and I'm not sure what will happen, but I'm very worried about the trans players in Brazil that have started grassroots work and now have to play under this particular government, is what I would say.
I'll move to Stephanie to your question. So I would actually say that was probably an underestimation. I don't think that he really knew anything, and actually there's some great sort of pushback against him in the Brazilian press. But the estimates were that there were other estimates, let's say, were that there were 1,000 games being played per week in Brazil of women's football at the time, right? So that's
1940.
1940, yeah. So plenty of women's football, and so 200 around Rio would have been, within the realm of possibility. But I would say, if anything, it was underestimation.
Catholic Church. They get really mad. The Archbishop of Peru calls for a complete ban on women's soccer.
Sure. There's
Archbishop of Lima.
Right.
And that's 1930s. I'm going to say I would have to reread the book for the exact date, but somewhere in the 1930s.
Right. The Catholic, the Morality League in Colombia that prevents the Costa Rican team from coming in is basically conservative Catholic men who are trying to protect the morality of Colombian women. Yes. I mean, of course, right?
And soccer's played on Sunday. Soccer's played on Sunday, and it's a big fight in the early 20th century for men to play on Sunday. And the Catholic Church says, make it Saturday. And the men are like, I don't really want to go to church. And, it's a really strong secularizing institution. But women don't have the privilege, even if they had wanted to be able to say, I don't want to go to church. Rio's the biggest diocese in the world at that time. Very conservative Catholic Church there.
Argentine priest preaching from the pulpit, saying like women's soccer is bad. You should not play.
So,
but I'm going to give a counterpoint, which is in 1939. There's the first Panamanian women's soccer league is actually called Liga Católica, and it's a series of it's like 4 Catholic schools in Panama City that start women's soccer. So there's a small counterpoint.
Yeah, well, there's kind of like post-Vatican II, I'm sure, and
39,
and Catholic Action, So I'm sure there are individual, groups that are able to push back. I just know from the top hierarchy, it's pretty negative.
Okay, let's get another round of questions. We have a hand here.
Yeah, I was wondering if during the book, because of course I haven't read, if you did some comparisons of how Latin America managed soccer vis-a-vis other sports, because I would say I'm not sure if it's similar to other sports, women practicing other sports, or it was so hostile specifically against football because football is the biggest sport in most of the countries that you study.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then just next to Amy over here. Sorry. Just up. Yeah.
You go first? Yeah. Sorry, I usually give up the mic. I want to applaud you on this extraordinary Herculean effort to do this book.
Thank you. Nice.
I've been there when you see that photo, you're like, where is this from? What's the date? So, I mean, congratulations. I'm looking forward to reading this. So, but I wanted to connect this discussion to the previous panel. I mean, as I sense the discussion, if this is a session about the women's game in global context, I mean, I fear, or I wonder, maybe I should say, that this is a discussion that becomes about progressive U.S., backward global South. And, you've got your thuggery folks who run these federations. I mean, we have a lot of thuggery in this country. So I'm just wondering if, you have any and maybe that's the takeaway. Maybe the work here is about, I mean, I don't think so. But I mean, I just wonder if you could speak to that question, because if we think about it, because in some ways we talk about the men's game, it's actually different, right? Like how the U.S., sort of the way you were sort of setting up earlier, is, you know, backwards in certain senses. I was wondering, how would you respond to this comment?
Thank you.
Why don't you go for it?
Oh,
Those are two meaty questions.
okay. You want to do first or second? You do first.
So yeah, we do a lot of comparison, actually. So with basketball, with tennis, with shooting, with physical education, basically, when Brazil puts the ban in place, the ban is against rough sports. So it's against judo, boxing, wrestling, soccer, right, and polo. But so it is. But it really is. I mean, as the other sports, the ban gets lifted earlier, and it's, you know, it's really targeted at soccer. The resistance, generally speaking, across Latin America is to soccer, right? Because it is the national sport, because it's the way that it's one of the ways that defines the male nation, right? The masculine side of the nation. So women playing are inherently transgressive in that sort of mindset. And so, yeah, in Mexico, basketball has this huge, and Chile and Argentina, basketball has this huge wave in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And it gets a lot of support in the press. There's criticism of basketball in the 20s that goes away by the 30s and 40s. Maybe as soccer, I don't actually know if we ever sort of thought this out, but as soccer sort of gets more and more popular, basketball becomes more acceptable as right, as an alternate. So yeah, I mean, we do a lot with, you know, why soccer and how soccer, right? It's a space of female sociability that male institutions really want to cut down, right? Cut off.
There's also the question of individual sports versus team sports. So in general, when we do the comparison, team sports are far more transgressive, according to most of these patriarchal institutions, than our individual sports. It doesn't mean that that individual sports can't be transgressive, but tends to be that a team of women that don't play for men is disturbing. It's like disturbing the order, the aesthetic order, the social order, right? It just has the idea that women would bond together, not with an objective of pleasing men, is just really radical in and of itself. Like, to have free time away from the domestic space, you know, public space, those types of things. So you have someone like, you know, Maria Esther Bueno, who's a very important tennis player in Brazil and is partners with Althea Gibson for a certain amount of time. And she's very white and she's very elite and she's very conservative. And the Brazilian press just loves her. I mean, Jet Magazine names her Athlete of the Year. A couple of people write in and are like, you know, Althea, and you know, but she's absolutely acceptable to those ideas of proper femininity, which is coded as white, and the Brazilian team, you know.
And there's also a class thing, right? Tennis is an upper class sport. Shooting is an upper class sport.
Yeah.
Swimming is, generally speaking, an upper class sport.
Yeah, it's just not so rowdy. So all those things come into play in the book, and they're different in every country. So we are painting a, you know, sort of really generalizing picture here. And I just thank you so much for that question and for this one about the global south, because you know it would break my heart if people went away thinking that I was telling that kind of a story, but I get it. But this is a couple things about that. About, you know, is it a story of the U.S. as a site of progress? Once again, just want to hammer home, I think it's apples and oranges to think about soccer in Latin America and here, because it is not identified with the most type of masculine comportment, right? That would be North American football or baseball or basketball. And how are women doing in those sports would be the comparative question, right? That would be what's similar. So it's not really similar. U.S. men have an alternative culture in terms of soccer, with it being fifth or whatever you want to, what is it, fifth, sixth most popular sport among men? I don't know, but the other ones. And so I'm marginalizing them. And so it's not that, but also still, what we tried to show with things like the 1971 unofficial Women's World Cup was that Latin American women were doing really innovative things, whether it's Costa Rica, and they were sort of, yes, they probably dealt with the bleakest landscape that was around in Brazil, or one of them at the time, but they also found ways around it. And that's hard to present because we'd have to get really into the woods in some of the things. But like, for example, one particular team draws upon her relationship with the military government and her brother to kind of protect her from the police coming after her soccer team. So there's, all of these different things that they do, from like doing it under the cover of the circus, from, you know what I mean? And in Argentina, from, having bake sales to send them to the Women's World Cup, and the Chilean team, who's unionized, again, before the U.S. women. Not to say that the U.S. women should follow that model, but to say there are other innovative models out there that are being done. And I just say there's no Title IX. So it's another really tough comparison. No sports in universities in Latin America in the same way. So that makes it a really tough comparison. Just to say, however, the linkage between Ni Una Menos, which is the collection of feminist movements today in Latin America, and that connection with sports is something that is really worth looking at and thinking at for U.S. women here and feminists, and the way in which they've just broken open kind of what is gender violence through direct action, right? They're going on strike. Their International Women's Day, they were like, I'm not teaching, I'm not anywhere. They were on national strike in Argentina. Like, yes, ma'am. You know what I mean? So there's innovative sort of things coming out of there. And in those strikes, the women's fans have these whole legions that are like, we're taking back the stadium. Like, this is not going to be something we're left out of anymore. So I don't know. So certainly, like, I just think it's like a really exciting place right now for those protests, and not sort of like, I don't think that they should follow a U.S. model, quite honestly. I don't think it's going to work in that. I don't think they should follow market mentality, to be honest with you, because we saw with the Colombian League when they tried to do that, and it was awful. They ended up treating the players like really awfully. And so when we talked to Argentine, I was in Rio last month. I talked to them. I said, are you excited about the Argentine League? And they were like, nope. We want feminist football, not women's football. So they said football feminista, not football femenino. And we don't want to be treated like crap. We'd rather be amateur than go into a professional league. So it's it's just a debate. Anyway.
And I just want to say, sorry.
No, I mean, please. I'll just sit here doing it.
But I think it's also, we have this sort of, I think, probably somewhat misconception about how, quote unquote, advanced, right, we might be anyway. I mean, the U.S. Soccer Federation is fighting a lawsuit against the women's team, right? Like, how advanced is that? Right? Like, and so when we think about sort of the soccer institutions, right, they are run around the world by, let's say, backwards men, right? Women's football generally is really strong on a grassroots level, in part because that's the only way that they could exist, right? That's the only way that the teams and leagues would sort of continue to function, was that. So I think, right, like, going to a market model might not be the best thing, right? Because it means control by these institutions that have, since women began playing soccer, really acted against the best interest of the sport.
It's such an important point, but I think there's something really fascinating about the grassroots culture in the United States, which is, it's it's hard. It's a hard moment to celebrate something in American culture, right? But it's an extraordinary set of grassroots institutions that exist to promote women's athletics. And on the one hand, you can't help but notice the incredible disparity between, women's sports and men's sports, or boys' sports and girls' sports in the United States. The inequality is probably more profound than in any other place. But at the same time, there is something about the emergence of girls and women's sports in this country, even in the sports like the in your apples and oranges story, the basketballs and other sports. That's pretty interesting. So it's interesting to think about this elite tier that has been so backwards and has done so much to prevent, I think, the grassroots energy from moving up.
Well, and just to be fair, most Latin American women that we interview are very excited to play NCAA soccer, because they don't have an option after 18. So Title IX has benefited global women's soccer, not just U.S. women's soccer. I mean, the captain of Venezuela was at University of Indiana.
Half the Mexican national team. So Title IX and NCAA soccer has been great. And when I interviewed Sissy, I said, about the '99 World Cup, and I said, what was it like playing against the U.S. team? She said, oh, God, I just love them. I wanted to beat them so bad, but I love them so much. It's not for nothing. It's not like they're just dismissive of that either.
I make the point in part because it's a moment where I think, people who follow the United States political situation carefully should be really nervous about any decent policy that promotes women's equity. So I don't know what the standing of these laws is going to be, but I think we shouldn't take for granted the success at the grassroots that some of our policies have helped to support. Yeah. Okay, I want to try to get some new voices here, so let's go 1, and then 2, and 3. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you did any research or work into what youth soccer was like kind of in South America and Latin America, because I think we talk about that a lot, how it's generally been supported in the U.S. going back to a certain point, but what that was back, a long time ago versus when they lost all the support and became banned overall, and then what it's like now. You mentioned that the Argentine team has one of the older teams, so is that something that's still suffering today?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another question here?
Great question.
There's time. It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I'm listening to so much of what you guys are talking about, I'm hearing this real willingness to be looked at with new roles in Latin America. I'm more than the box that you've put me in. Some of the success that I think the U.S. Has had is the space to allow dads to have that relationship, and that's what I think the grassroots level really to give our culture, the men of our culture, the space to be supportive of their daughters in a sport experience. And there's an amazing ESPN reporter, the basketball Chinwe, and her family's from Nigeria, and her dad holds his position as this male authoritarian in Nigeria. But then they moved to Houston, and the girls all went on NCAA scholarships to basketball. And now she's like the broadcaster for ESPN Africa. So these new roles, and are you hopeful that the culture gives a little bit more space for men to have a new role of not being so adversarial, and for women to show the role of I'm more than what the Catholic Church has told me and you that I am?
Great.
And I just want to say something in case people didn't hear this news, but the Vatican is launching their women's team after 48 years of having a man's team, and their first game is May 26 against Roma, and then they're going on tour. They're going to go to Vienna, and that's a big deal. it sends a very good message, I think. And the Pope spoke about it. I think it was yesterday. So I think it's is something positive in the right direction.
So if you could bring the mic back.
Thank you for saying that.
One more question.
Because I didn't know about it.
In the back row, right there. Yeah.
I knew about it from Shireen's, but just yesterday.
You kind of touched on this a little bit when discussing sort of the grassroots thing and sort of the male institutions, if you will, or male-dominated institutions. And I'm curious about the notion of clubs, because obviously around the world, right, the game is very much run on a club system. And the idea of, say, a women's-only club and how that might fit in versus, a women's team within what has been traditionally a male club. I think in one of the photos, you had Fluminense in there, and I didn't know the other team. What was it? Okay.
And that's not the real Fluminense. It's in Minas mocking the other Fluminense in Rio.
Okay. Sure. But I mean, I even think about clubs here in the U.S., right, where you have the NWSL. I mean, you mentioned the Thorns, right? And the Thorns are related to the Timbers, whereas other NWSL clubs are not related or affiliated. You mentioned Juventus, and we've seen it all over, right, and that notion. I'm just kind of curious about that in Latin America and your thoughts on the affiliations.
Okay, here's what we're going to do, because we have about 5 minutes before we break, and can you stop right there? There's a hand, one more hand. I'm going to bring in one more question. I know I'm giving you a long list, but you can just kind of freestyle when you're done. You can pick the answers you want to hit. Go ahead.
Okay. So the question that I have is something that we kind of briefly touched on about players that would prefer to play amateur than be under the institutions that would professionalize their play. And I know that there was an article, I think it came out yesterday in The Athletic, where Otto Hegerberg is talking about this exact spectrum. And broke college kid, I don't have a subscription to The Athletic that I've renewed recently, so I didn't read the whole thing. But I'm going to assume that she continues to go on to talk about like her decision to not play, and how that's very different than the U.S.'s approach to the lawsuit and approaching like reform versus revolution of the system. So if you have any opinions on that, I think that's.
What a badass is Ada Hegerberg.
Yeah,
I just want to say, like, whoa. Hats off to. We'll go through quick. You do youth soccer, I guess.
Okay, so I'm gonna sort of touch on the question of youth soccer primarily in Mexico, because it's the place where I have the most sort of contacts, and basically, so youth for a long time. Girls youth soccer in Mexico was sort of word of mouth, right? So I interviewed one player who played on the national team in the 2000s, and she said, when I was a kid, two friends of mine and I would sort of dream of playing soccer, and we never saw anybody. We would sit out on our stoop and we'd play in the street, and then one day this woman walked by in a soccer uniform, and we just followed her, and right, and they followed her, and there was this game, and so then, yeah, totally, they were like. It's like you wish it into existence, right? And so basically for a number of years, the way that Mexican women's soccer stayed and Mexican youth soccer for girls was like they would just play with women's teams, right? And then as sort of the generation of 99 and into the early 2000s, sort of, they began to develop soccer schools. So private soccer schools for girls sort of grew up all over Mexico in the, let's say, late 1990s and early 2000s. Within the last 5 years, the Mexican Federation has really tried to get a handle on how many girls leagues there are, how many girls schools there are, and trying to, I don't think that they're trying to sort of take over and organize them, but they are trying to get a handle on it. And there are literally hundreds of schools around Mexico for girls to play that are privately organized, often by former national team players. But it's definitely something that they are now focused on quite a bit more in Mexico.
In Argentina, just because you specifically referenced that older thing, it's still awful. Only in Buenos Aires and really upper class Buenos Aires can you find them. There was a girl in Mendoza who was driven out of a club who wanted her to play. And it became a national conversation because the Argentine Federation said she can't play. There's no mixed teams. Booted her out, and it was kind of a big deal. My own daughter, just anecdotally, I lived in Argentina last year. I was teaching there. She's a midfielder. We went to 10 clubs around the capital. Every single one said, we have rhythmic gymnastics for you, but no soccer till you're 14. And, to the point where she's just crying. She's like, I play with boys all the time. I play with boys. It's not a problem. So that's one thing in the U.S. that I think is really a great sort of opportunity is mixed teams that they don't have in Latin America. It's just really fun. It's like mixed tennis doubles. It's kind of just awesome. It's just another thing. And it would be great to have it. There's still a lot of segregation. So in the case of Argentina, I thought it wasn't as exciting as what's going on in Mexico. Anyway, real quick, we got to be quick. Oh, men, dudes, dads, space, men. All right, men, collect one another. It's like, what more can we do for you? I'm kidding. I sort of. Jeez, it's recorded. Oh, I hate that.
It's live.
Yeah. Like, okay, here's something that was great. Minnesota. Minnesota's got this fan club in MLS. And do you remember they were going to trade for the player who had been convicted of domestic violence or accused?
Convicted.
Yeah. And the men got together from that. Maybe you remember more. A friend of ours, Eric Silva,
I know it.
Brendan was there. Yeah. And
it's as fake as your knowledge of it.
Okay, great. And they petitioned to the club and said, review this before you take this. The fan clubs really had a lot to say with it, and I thought that was fantastic. I thought that was absolutely. I don't think they should take any more of women's platforms in women's soccer than they've always taken, but stuff like that, that's good on them. So yes, I do think, in the U.S. there's maybe an alternative soccer culture, and I hope in Latin America we see more of that as the social clubs might be revitalized.
Although what's also interesting about that, again, I'm going to make recourse to Mexico. Most of the women players who remember being punished for playing were punished by their mothers, not by their fathers. Their fathers tended to support them. They were the ones who taught them to play, maybe with their sons, maybe without, maybe because they didn't have sons.
Yeah, but men don't bear the burden of raising the proper girl.
Of course. I totally agree with you.
I'm just being a mother. No, I'm just whining.
I totally agree with that. But it is interesting that a lot of the players say that their fathers did give them that space, right? Or their brothers gave them that space.
Yeah.
So it's not quite it's not everything that we might think it is.
It's not gathering all of her friends and starting a team and being their coach.
No.
Which is what we've allowed dads to do here.
Mm-hmm.
And that in turn then, took just helped shape that format.
Mm-hmm. In Costa Rica, they did. Yeah. The men, they
feel hopeful.
Gathered
that space.
Yeah.
That space will.
Masculine roles aren't so hard.
Oppositional.
Yeah. It's just a fine line between that and the takeover.
Right. Between that and
so
not
it's
being able to get a job as a coach.
It's always a fine line between the taking
Oppression.
the space, between taking women's space, taking women's platform, and being the allies. Right. It's always like a tricky and a dance, tango.
So on the dance bit, in terms of our choreography for this afternoon,
yes,
very well.
We are. I was so enthralled by the presentation here that I forgot that you were supposed to end at 4:30, and it was actually the next panel that starts at 4:45. Shireen was like, "I knew, I'm up next."
I'm sorry.
I would know. You don't apologize at all because it was just great. It was like that highlight reel that you don't want to end, and so that's kind of how this day is. It's just like each panel is a highlight reel, and it's not that this panel or the one before wasn't amazing. They both were. It's just that the next two are also amazing. And so I want to make sure that we have time for all of them. And I probably, some of you are here because you listened to Burn It All Down, those of you who are not here because you listened to it
Yeah.
will be listening to it after today. And so the thing is that Brenda, who just like totally rocked that panel, now is going to be on the next one too. And so what I want to do, I want to keep the energy in the room here because I think this is great. So I have three requests of you. First of all, I want to do just like a quick stretch. Like we'll get up, we'll rest, we'll stretch our legs a little bit, but we won't like all go out and, you know, run outside and you know, go get coffee a block away, because I want to get us all back here in like 5 to 10 minutes to start again. We have a little bit of slack time. That's the first thing I want us to do. The second thing I want you to do is this is the time to pull out your phones and order this book, which we promised. So I feel like we could do it. It's for now. Now, if you're an NYU student and you're paying that, you know, that tuition, you can ignore this part of the message. But for the rest of us, it's called Futbolera. It's out next week. You don't have to do it this second, but I think if we all just order the book, they'll be able to tell, you know, when they get home. And there are going to be more books tonight, so don't spend all your money now. You know, I'm going to make you do this on a couple more occasions over the night. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing I want you to do before we all stretch for just 5 minutes, and then I get difficult and bring you back in the room for what you are not going to miss, which is this Burn It All Down hot take, is join me in thanking these guys and helping launch them onto their book tour. That was great.